At this time of the year, most people's focus is on what next year's biggest trends will be. Right now is no exception. To predict the future trends in the world of special objects, Karaviki, one of the world's leading marketplaces for collectibles, has partnered with CrowdDNA. From this partnership, Karaviki and CrowdDNA has published a report on next year's biggest trends in the secondary market. Today, we take a close look at some of the dominant and sustainable trends for the year 2022. Giovanni Botero, you are one of Karaviki's expert of Japanese art. Why do you think people are drawn to the aesthetic of Japanese prints and paintings right now?
Well, the love affair between the West and Japan and Japanese art has deep roots. Historically, the very bold and colorful design of woodblock prints have inspired and fascinated Western artists for a long time. For example, Claude Monet or Vincent van Gogh, they famously not only appreciated but also collected woodblock prints. So there's definitely a continuity there because we can draw a line from the time of this first encounter to the present day, where we see that the popularity of woodblock prints, for example, has not waned but is well and alive. In fact, in more recent times, also because of the pandemic, there's this renewed desire to cultivate one's passions, to collect, and also to decorate one's home, which has taken on a different meaning, obviously. At a time when the physical travel has been restricted, Japanese art and woodblock prints really allow you to be transported to this idealized world that is full of alluring courtesans and fierce warriors and lavishly dressed kabuki actors, and this we're seeing that is ever so popular right now.
But is it a bit like in the 19th century when the arts and crafts movement declared war on the emerging industrial mass production?
Well, it is not exactly that, because obviously that situation was very specific to England and the 19th century and its relation to the Industrial Revolution. But we are definitely seeing that there's this move away from the so-called convenience or fast culture and and a renewed interest in craftsmanship that is in objects that are unique and artfully crafted by skilled artisans. And the woodblock prints really exemplify one of the apex of this type of craftsmanship, thanks to the collaboration of the people involved in making them.
So, what is actually the difference between Japanese painting and prints, and specifically woodblock prints, would you say?
Well, yes, the Japanese painting is created by a single or more than one artist who will apply ink or colors directly onto either a support that is traditionally either paper or silk. On the other hand, so in a way, it is sort of a unique object that can be copied, of course, but is made by one single person. On the other hand, woodblock prints are made from a set of blocks of wood that are carved, and therefore from a set of wood blocks, you can pull, as they say, or create many different impressions of the same design. And it is specifically this technique that really displays a very high level of craftsmanship.
And what would you then say is the difference between the Japanese woodcut and the European ones?
Well, the difference, they are quite different because Western woodcuts or Western woodblock prints are were used mainly for book illustrations, and they're also most of them only monochrome. Whereas the Japanese woodblock print is famous for is very rich colors and for the very different type of color palette and a very unique design. Also because, of course, it its iconography draws from the very rich culture of East Asia, of China, Korea, and Japan.
I think we all know who Hokusai are, or at least we have seen his woodblock prints, The Great Way of Kanagawa. But are there any
Absolutely.
specific colors trends or theme trends that you have identified within Japanese prints and paintings?
Yes, what we've seen more recently is that the whether it is a contemporary print or an older print, made still in the same traditional, using the same traditional process, we see that even in contemporary prints, there is a great use of rich colors such as gold and blues. For example, one specific artist that comes to mind is a contemporary artist called Hajime Namiki, who creates these really majestic pictures that have rich gold backgrounds. And one of these favorite themes are trees. So these are trees that are actual real trees found in Japan, trees that are there's centuries old, and this theme has proved to be very popular. And this use of rich backgrounds with gold and very bright blues. At the same time, the same thing, we can also see some trends in so-called traditional ukiyo-e, so older pictures from the 19th century. There's, for example, one very special object that we sold in the exclusive woodblock print auction only last week, which was an album that contained um, 10 complete triptychs and 12 diptychs that were bound together. And these were all created between 1847 and 1866. And what was really unique about that this was not only the reflection of somebody collecting this already in the 19th century, but all these prints were kept in mint condition. So in a way, it's an object that already oozes the passion of somebody else who collected it. And more importantly, among the different artists included in the album, there's one that is Utagawa Yoshi. He is a very popular artist who started by drawing in his early career and drawing triptychs of especially of warriors, very dynamic. And then later in his years, he during his career, he started become more versatile and working with the so-called giga or comic pictures. These are very, very funny and really show the ingenuity of creating these funny designs. And one specific thing that he was obsessed with was cats, and cats feature very prominently in his prints. And this is also something that we see that's very popular even with contemporary artists.
Mm-hmm. Cat is not the first animal you think about in the Japanese culture, is it?
No, well, yeah, there's definitely, but that's what was interesting is that for Kuniyoshi, so we're talking about mid 19th century, these kind of animals were becoming more popular, and you can actually see them a lot in prints.
Interesting. So, Alexander Fall, you're one of the Katowice's experts of design. One of the greatest trends of 2022 are what we call, or you call, iconic classics. What do you mean by that, first of all?
Yes, an iconic classic, I would say, is an object that stood the test of time in use. So it's pretty much designs that stand out since, yes, maybe 100 years or maybe 70 years, but for a long time, and they are popular ever since they came out, and because of certain characteristics we talk about later.
Mm. So, craft also play a big role actually in the trend of iconic design, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, iconic classics wouldn't be classics, and what I said stood the test of time if they weren't the result of great craftsmanship. So a real classic is always of impeccable quality. And that's why we enjoy furniture, handbags, watches, which are 70, 80, 100 years old still. I don't think we will ever have a 100-year-old IKEA Billy bookcase in our auctions at Katowice, and if we do, it would be a very much surprise. But a Bauhaus chair of Marcel Breuer, definitely.
Mm. So would you say, I mean, with other words, you would say the quality was generally better in the past, wasn't it?
Yeah, you would think so, like good old times, but I think it's not that simple. I would say good and bad quality existed at all times, definitely. We now only see the good stuff because it lasted that long. So, but of course, in the past, things were very durable. The majority of people simply had not the means to buy new stuff all the time. And of course, the attitude was also different. It was not a throwaway society like today, and fashions were much not so short-lived, I would say. So, but during the 20th century, this changed, and we preferred cheap and easily replaceable stuff that can make room for the next thing. So, and that's why cheap mass production flooded the markets. And I think that's the reason why we think that the quality went downhill in general, because there are so much of it on the market. But I think nevertheless, good quality still exists. And I think just new stuff just comes with a price. And yeah, and that's why I think yeah, go to Katowice and buy an iconic classic there, and you get high quality for a reasonable price, and of course with nice patina too. So
True. No, I agree, and it's rather unique. It has the provenance that could be of interest, etc. So it's just increase the value for the owner, I would say. But what does the category iconic classic include according to you then?
yeah, I mean, icons can and do occur in probably all fields. So Picasso is of course an iconic name in the art world for sure. I mean, basically, you can find icons in every category. But for me personally, it fits a little more for objects of utility. So handbags, furniture, fashion, musical instruments, cameras, and watches. But I mean, icons are everywhere. So
That means that you believe that the watch market will continue, because obviously that has been a very, very strong trend the last few years, hasn't it?
yes, definitely.
Yeah. So what do you think it takes for an object to become an iconic classic then? Is it just a brand, or what's the...
No, I think it's pretty easy. For me, there are only two characteristics, and the foremost is the functionality and the usability. So whether it's a Birkin bag or an Eames lounge chair or a Leica camera or a Fender guitar, they are all incredibly useful and functional. So the design is always perfectly thought through, and that's what it is. And if an object is just beautiful but impractical, in my opinion, it won't ever become an iconic classic. But on the other hand, of course, the appearance is also an important point. So this design is often simple but striking. So that's something. It is often rather clean and quiet. That's why it's so timeless. Take a Bang& Olufsen hi-fi system, the sound is perfect and the design is so timeless, it could go in every interior without disturbing it. So that's the two. So the design and the functionality must be there. So
True. Do you see any difference in ownership of this type of item from before? I mean, is it just a matter of owning these things for yourself, or is it also some kind of investment?
yeah, I mean, the question of investment, I think, depends greatly on the sort of object. But of course, most objects of use have been acquired to use it first. So, a piece of furniture you want to sit in or live in, a piece of fashion you want to wear it first. But then when like the acknowledgement of connoisseurs start, they acknowledge the stable value, and not only for the money the value, but also the cultural value of these items. And now this trend, I think, captures the passionate enthusiast, and who we cater at Katawiki mainly. And I think now also the objects are acquired for some kind of investment. I mean, the results we achieve for certain handbags at Katawiki increases by 14% per year. So that's even better than gold, and this speaks for itself. But I think it depends on the sort of object. Furniture icons are much more stable. They, I would not say they increase their value as much as maybe a Birkin bag or something like this. So it is dependent on the object. But for me personally, I would say the passion has to come first for the object, and then thoughts about investment and this kind of things.
True. When you start in that way, it's almost always get to a good investment in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So iconic design classics fit greatly in many interior styles because of their timeless look, but that's not the only reason this trend is on the rise, is it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, as I said, I think iconic classic will always be a trend, but what we notice now is even a bigger increase of interest. And I mean, we live in turbulent times, so people are always drawn to familiar things, to things with a certain history. And also, we have endless options to choose from in the world, and it's often an easy and calming thing to turn to classics with a stable value. You know what you get when you have them. And also for me, also I think a very big thing is sustainability and preserving the environment are big topics now. So the interest for long-lasting and durable and high-quality products, and of course second-hand use, is very much increasing. So, and we want to overcome or try to overcome the throwaway mentality. And yeah, that's a great thing about Karviki, I think, because it connects people that to in order to find a new home for something instead of throwing it away. So that's
True. I used to say that we are operating in the most sustainable business there are, actually, because everything is already produced and we just sell it over and over again, aren't we?
yeah, that's right. True, true.
Every decade has its trend born out of nostalgia. Lorenzo Altimani, you are one of the experts of fashion and vintage, and you predict a shift of interest into nostalgia of the 90s. How come?
Out of the trends report, basically, it came out that a lot of people are starting now to shift from the 80s onto the 90s. And this is usually the chronological order in trends. Regardless of the category, it kind of works like this. For example, a lot of people that are becoming collectors nowadays can still remember those times, and those objects that maybe could not be purchased back then are available now. So people are trying to find anchors to what is familiar to them. And also, it's kind of like a safety purchase or something that gives you a lot of joy. And this is also how I see it. Also, on Katawiki, we have seen a strong demand for objects coming from that decade, especially in fashion. And this is also because, for example, when we talk about fashion, the 90s were kind of a breaking point, and it's very relatable to the current situation that we are experiencing, for example, COVID. So in the post-pandemic world, we will experience some kind of rejuvenation in society. This happened in fashion in the 90s, and so fashion will follow also in the years to come, but especially in 2022, I would say.
So, I mean, this is how the society of the 90s influenced high-end fashion. How does that connect to nowadays? You think that the COVID is one effect of that?
Somehow, yes. So, for example, the early 90s were very unstable politically and economically. Young people, were kind of disagreeing with the status quo of the world situation and really wanted to express themselves in a way that's anti-conformist. So the fashion world was inspired by this kind of anti-fashion movement. So it was a lot about grunge style, which was passed on to the catwalks, for example, or also subcultures were very influential in the fashion world. And then towards the end of the millennium, we see more extravagant clothing also linked to the uncertainty of what would happen in the year 2000, for example. There was a lot of confusion back then. So the kind of instability that people were facing back then is very reminiscent of the instability that we are experiencing now. And this is what really connects how fashion behaves in the late 90s and how it behaves now. It's always cyclical. Every 20 years, a new trend comes back from the 20 years before, for example. So we move from the 80s onto the 90s, and it's very applicable. And I think people are really looking to expressing themselves with items that they are kind of familiar with, but have become sort of unique and also are a statement of some kind of fashion revolution.
And which fashion trends of the 90s do we need to be particularly prepared for?
There are quite a few trends originating from the 90s, but the main ones would be definitely grunge and minimalism, and to a lower extent, some kind of Orientalism trend that was very present in the end of the 90s. So, for example, when we talk about grunge style, it was originated in America in the late 80s to early 90s, and it was kind of like an expression of the non-look. A lot of people started to collect items from flea markets or charity shops, and it involved a lot of layering. And then nowadays, for example, in the current trends, and also these are trends that will, of course, stay in the catwalks, we see a lot of layering, comfortable clothing, hoodies, loose fitting pants, comfortable shoes, a lot of colors, for example, bright colors. And we can see that also, for example, in the latest Gucci collection that has just come out, the Spring Summer 22. So it's very streetwear inspired, nowadays, and this really originates from the 90s. Another trend would be minimalism. This is really something that started in the mid 90s, and a lot of clothing became, dark with very straight silhouettes, monochromatic looks, and very subtle branding. For example, at Katawiki, it's very important because we do have a lot of brands like Prada and Fendi that are very much available, but are very reminiscent of this time, and we do see a strong demand and also quite a strong offering from sellers. So also this is very connected to the grunge look in the sense that designers for the next collections have revisited the grunge look, but with very minimalistic touch. For example, the colors are not super bold anymore, but they're kind of like earthy tones. They're using very high quality materials that are flowing comfortable, like silk, wool, cashmere, and so on. And we do expect to see quite a strong demand in this type of direction also on our platform.
But when you say that people were going to the flea markets to find the clothes for the grunge era, but who were actually the designers that really stood out in the 90s then?
For example, yeah, there's very iconic collections from Anna Sui and Marc Jacobs in 1993. They took inspiration from this trend that was present among young people, and they proposed on the catwalks a lot of layered looks and things that maybe were a bit clashing together. So they offered a new perspective on styling and also buying fashion. So these would be very important from grunge style. Otherwise, when we talk about, minimalism, we would have the likes of Tom Ford, Helmut Lang, Margiela, Prada, and towards the end of the 90s, we also have Hussein Chalayan.
So they were actually inspired by the flea market findings, huh?
Yeah, especially the ones that really interpreted the grunge look.
Yeah, yeah. Has the 90s fashion become collectible today?
I would say so for many different reasons. Well, for example, I would say that fashion was more visionary back then. You know, garments were real artworks and the quality was super good. For example, we can talk about the spray dress that was displayed at the McQueen fashion show in 1999. You know, it was kind of like more eventful. And then also, fashion was a conveyor of political messages, cultural messages, also coming from the punk culture and the techno club culture. And also, it was very artistic. So, modern fashion doesn't really have much of that, unfortunately. And we do see a very strong demand for iconic pieces. For example, on Katawiki, we had a beautiful and very rare pair of Jean-Paul Gaultier steampunk glasses that we sold for about 1,000 euros. And we see a very strong demand for these kind of collectible items. Also, another topic that I would like to touch in the sense of fashion being collectible is the fact that towards the end of the 90s, we do have quite a lot of collections that had a very strong cultural influence, for example, from Asia or from the Middle East. In 1997, John Galliano proposed at Dior a very strong cultural touch coming from, you know, typical Chinese dresses or Korean prints. And then also Hussein Chalayan had this beautiful collection in 1998 that was made of different lengths of burqa dresses. And you know, nowadays, as my colleague earlier said, we cannot really travel. So by collecting these iconic pieces, we can really travel with imagination. And then also relating to the classic topic, these items, for example, from the major fashion houses, have become very sought after because the quality was also even higher than it is nowadays.
Yeah.
And people would prefer to buy the original item rather than re-editions. And we do see a very, very strong demand on classics coming from that era.
It's interesting. I mean, you talk about the material and the quality of material. Alexander, you're talking about also the material. Do you see any parallel or similarities between these trends? Are those the ones, or are there any others?
Well, in relation to sort of iconics, I do find some interesting similarities. I mean, obviously, if we talk of icons, as you, Pontus, mentioned before, Hokusai's great wave of Kanagawa, I mean, talk about icons, that's probably possibly the most iconic picture in existence, and it's been reworked and reused by so many different artists and and prints.
And actually fashion makers as well, hasn't it? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you can find that print pretty much in every form and type of garment, right? So this kind of thing, I think it relates back to really the idea of iconicity.
Yeah, I would say that all trends are pretty much very connected because I think yes, craftsmanship is in fashion as well as in every other category we sell. Is it an important part, and all items of high quality are highly sought after. So that's always so it's always a big plus, and I think yes, and this applies also to fashion and of course. Yeah.
True. Lorenzo, do you want to add something?
I would say that, you know, classics and all these topics are very much related because something that is very iconic and classic is something that we all kind of connect to and we can strongly remember. And also it's something with a very good craftsmanship. So for example, you know, even in furniture, I would say that there's a lot of demand for vintage items that are, you know, like very emblematic that we all can remember and that will always kind of stay with us. And you know, I really believe that the world of today is really looking to invest in pieces that do have some kind of history linked to them.
Exactly, the history is the good part, because we try always to infuse our contemporary life with something historical, so with fashion, clothes, or with art or furniture from the past. So
Yeah. Same goes for Japanese art. I mean, you really talk about holding one's history in one's hand. When you talk about ceramics and prints, and these are all objects that have a very rich heritage. So obviously they confer a certain status to the collector, as had always been the case.
Yeah, and just to add something to that, I would say that also, Japanese elements, for example, have always been influential in fashion. As I was saying before, like in the late 90s, we do have a lot of designers that propose Japanese prints and kind of kimonos on the runways. So we do see these kind of influences in art, in furniture, in fashion, and this is just to say that we kind of want to have different elements in our lives that can influence us.
And I think one of the similarities is the quality, because obviously when we talk about the Japanese handcraft, is always fantastic quality, and it's time consuming to make it, but that's also part of the quality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is interesting, and there's few times I agree so much with someone as I did with all of you, because I totally agree with those those trends coming up for 2022. So interesting to have this chat, and thank you for participating.